I'm Shamuel Avraham,
I'm David Mendez.
and right now we'll be looking at a paper originally written by a few UTD students about Japan, China, and their the ethical implications of their cultural differences. And we're just gonna jump right into it. So the main thing this paper is about how these differences in cultures translate into ethics. There are many cultural differences between these three countries. They're a lot deeper than surface level. For example, in the U.S., we may prefer going to one place while Japan prefers another type of shopping or stuff like that. But when we look deeper, these small differences in behavior can really dictate the ethical behaviors of an entire country and their citizens. So this paper will be mostly about that, pointing out a few of the differences based on Hofstede's six dimensions and diving in what that means for the ethical environment of each country.
Regarding Hofstede's six-dimension model, there's a quiet polar difference in each dimension. Individualism and indulgence are the only categories that the US surpasses the Japanese in. On the other hand, power distance, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, and long-term orientation, the Japanese surpass the US, with power distance being the closest category overall. Um, on Hofstede model, it described China as having very high power distance and long-term orientation, while also holding low individualism, uncertainty avoidance, and indulgence. The most notable ethical comparison is long-term orientation. While in the States, it is viewed as a potential negative thing if an individual lingers within a company for too long. In Japan, loyalty is highly valued, and if your resume shows job moves every 3 or 4 years, it is not respected. The Japanese also have much more cultural traditions than the US does, which means lacking knowledge of their culture could backfire, especially in business. When it comes to customer service itself, the Japanese have a very high expectation. Like many countries, in Japan, tips are not required, and apparently the service in a fast food restaurant will be comparable to that of an upscale restaurant in the United States. This will be impressionable on both cultures for different reasons. Americans will be impressed when when in Japan, and at the same time it will upset at how the Japanese might not tip, whereas the Japanese might be upset that they receive poor service at many different businesses. Um, Regarding the customer service of Japan, the Japanese have a concept called omotenashi, which translates to hospitality. That's why Japanese employees treat their customers with polite and welcoming service consistently. As we mentioned before, the customer service in the United States is less than desirable if you compare it with the Japanese. One of the reasons is due to the short-term orientation that the United States has. Customer service expectation in both China and Japan share a high expectation. They both value customer services as they view them as vital parts of selling brands and maintaining customer loyalty. Practicing this sort of business behavior has helped not only to maintain a strong customer loyalty population, but also helps attract a diverse type of generation with age appropriate service to various individuals.
So with this, it's beneficial for us to look to the ethical implications of what this means. For example, in the United States, or rather, we'll go into Japan and China beforehand. In Japan and China, because they have such a long-term view and view everyone in the unit, including their employees and their customers with their customer service, it usually means that they will be a little bit more ethical when it comes to customer behavior. Though we know in China there have been a few issues with customer service and products that have been subpar, but in more urbanized areas that is improving. Japan, it has almost always been the case that customer service has been so good, and because of that, um, Japan with its products will act very ethically to what it sources from, what it provides, and all these different things. In comparison, if we look at the United States, because of the short-term view, everything is more about profits and shareholder value. Um, Not that it's necessarily a bad thing, but in the wrong places, for example, with Enron and WorldCom, it can end up in huge ethical problems by exploiting the customer or exploiting different positions in order to maximize short-term profits instead of having a long-term view and long-term gains. In other words, in Japan and China, or at least in urbanized areas of China, um, these companies in the region will usually have a long-term view of customers and see them as loyal repeat customers. In the United States, it's more likely that companies will see customers as a short-term gain and not have a long-term view of how to keep customers and retain them for longer. And that can move on to employee loyalty.
So, as we mentioned in the past slides, Japan um, have a high score at long-term orientation, and that creates or that promotes loyalty between business and employees. The main we can see that difference in how the labor market works in the States and in Japan. In the States, normally people change their jobs every 3 or 4 years. In Japan, the employees um, continue all their life having the same exact job, and they are promoted because of seniority, not because of performance. Well, we already talked about that. Employee loyalty in the United States actually is counterproductive to stay in one job for the rest of their life here at the United States. So employees are expected to change career often.
Now, the when we compare these two countries, we can see oh, okay. We can see the differences in behavior, but we can also look at the ethical implications of how this applies to the workplace. For example, Japan for a very long time had issues where there were structural problems within countries or within companies that employees would not talk about simply because if they talked about these issues, they'd be seen as disloyal or ratting them out. Now, in a country where employees are hired for a company and they're hired for their loyalty, it's assumed that they will be there for the rest of their lives or until the country or company breaks down. In this kind of environment, it really discourages employees from saying uh, or calling out issues when they see them. Instead, employees are more likely to go with the flow to submit to seniority, and if they see something that might not be ethically acceptable, they're more likely to let it occur instead of blowing the whistle. In a couple companies in Japan, those who do whistleblow or point out ethical problems usually face or are usually seen as a pariah in their company and other companies, and it's usually hard for them to make a living or get another job because they're seen as a very disloyal employee, even if they did point out something that was extremely valid. Um, in contrast, when we look at the United States, we see because the United States does have a short-term orientation and because employees are willing to switch jobs very often, they're also more likely to blow the whistle and point out ethical problems within their companies because they know they'll probably be able to get a job in another place, and also because these ethical actions are valued very highly by other companies and in the economy and market in general. For example, in a lot of the financial crisis, or in the financial crisis, there were a couple people who blew the whistle um, on certain practices that were being done. Even though they might not have been able to get a job in the short run, in the long run, they were able to find somewhere else to work, and we can assume that they're able to make decent livings for their families. In Japan, this would be something that's not very feasible, just because um, with that ingrained loyalty and the company seen as this community endeavor, which does tie into Japan's collectivism, which we won't technically get into. Um, it does make it extremely hard to tackle ethical problems in Japan, which means that they'll snowball over time to a point that either it just becomes public because it's such a big ethical issue, or the company will implode on itself or crumble, and then it will be exposed to what happened. In the United States, this usually doesn't happen, and if it does happen, there usually be someone who will come afterwards or right beforehand and say this is going on. So with that, we can see that the United States short-term orientation is not a huge loss for them when it comes to ethics. If anything, it might be an advantage for them. And in this case, Japan's long-term orientation is a little bit of their downfall. In China, it's a little their long-term orientation. It's still yet to see what that happens, just because China takes a very capitalist approach to its markets and the way it structures itself. But we can assume, because of the long-term orientation of Chinese employees, that they would rather stay employed with such fast economic growth. But with that, we can also assume that they would not be adverse to blowing the whistle on certain companies or certain practices, as seen with the Chinese government crackdown. We can assume that the Communist Party will award Chinese citizens who do point out corruption within their companies. So with that, that is the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for staying around and listening. This is still an ongoing study. More data can be pulled from the different Hofstede 6 dimensions and looking into the ethical implications of each. However, we felt like these were the most important ones to look at and the most interesting. Thank you again for listening. Please contact the original students if you have any questions.